Imagine a sound. It is a sharp, electronic chirp. It is a digital demand for your attention. It is a noise that pierces through the heavy fog of sleep at exactly 6:30 a.m. You reach out, eyes still glued shut, and tap a cold glass screen. The silence returns. In that brief, hazy moment, you have interacted with the most ubiquitous, the most persistent, and perhaps the most hated piece of technology in human history, the alarm clock. We take it for granted today. We accept that time is a rigid grid. We believe we must wake up simply because a machine commands it. But if we pull back the heavy curtain of history, back past the microchips, past the glowing LEDs, and past the ticking brass gears, we find a world where waking up was not a lonely struggle. It wasn't a solitary battle between a human and a box. It was a human story. A story of sticks, stones, and social contracts. Picture yourself in the year 1850. You are standing in a narrow cobblestone alley in a northern industrial town in England. The air is thick and heavy. It tastes of coal smoke. It smells of damp wool. Feels like a weight on your chest. There is no electricity here. There are no streetlights to guide you, and certainly no glowing numbers on a nightstand to tell you how much sleep you have left. If you are a factory worker or a dock hand, time is no longer your own. In this new era, being late is not just an inconvenience. It is a disaster. It is a docking of your meager pay. It is a fast track to poverty. It is the risk of losing your place in the gate line to someone hungrier, leaner, and more desperate than you. You have to be at your station by 5 a.m. The sun won't be up for hours. The world is wrapped in a pitch-black shroud. How do you ensure you don't sleep through your livelihood? This was the great, silent anxiety of the Industrial Revolution. For the vast majority of human existence, we lived by a different rhythm. We followed the first sleep and second sleep cycle. We woke with the sun. We labored in the light. We slept when the world went dark. But the factories changed the rules. They didn't care about the seasons. They didn't care about the tilt of the earth. They demanded that thousands of people arrive at the exact same moment, every single day. Time had become a commodity, something to be bought, something to be sold, and something to be guarded. Now, you might think the solution was obvious. Why not just buy a clock? But in the mid-19th century, a reliable mechanical clock was a high-end luxury. It was a status symbol far beyond the reach of an average family struggling to buy bread. Even the early alarm inventions were tragically primitive. In America, a man named Levi Hutchins had constructed an alarm clock as early as 1787. But his invention was a reflection of his own rigid, personal discipline rather than a product for the masses. His clock only rang at 4 a.m. It couldn't be adjusted. It couldn't be silenced. If you needed to be up at 5 a.m., Levi's clock was a useless piece of brass. The working class needed something different. They needed a solution that was cheaper than a machine, more precise than a rooster, and more reliable than a prayer. And so, out of the shadows of the morning mist, emerged a figure that seems like a ghost to us now. The knocker-upper. Imagine that sound again. But this time it isn't a digital chirp. It is a rhythmic, hollow tap-tap-tap against the glass of your second-story window. You stir. You look out into the gray gloom. There, standing in the street below, is a silhouette. This is your human alarm clock. They aren't there to wake the entire street. They aren't there to disturb the peace. They are there specifically for you. The knocker-upper was a professional waker. For a few pence a week, they would navigate the labyrinthine streets of industrial giants like Manchester, London, or Liverpool. They carried the weight of the town's punctuality on their tired shoulders. Their tools were simple, yet they were perfectly adapted for the task. Some carried heavy wooden truncheons. These were for the ground floor tenants, used to beat a steady rhythm on the heavy oak doors. But the true elite of the profession used the long pole. This was a telescopic wand, usually crafted from bamboo or light wood. It allowed them to reach the upper windows, where the air was slightly cleaner and the workers slept in cramped lofts. There was a specific, unspoken etiquette to this craft. A knocker-upper wouldn't just bang on the glass and disappear into the night. That would be a failure of the profession. They would tap softly but persistently. It was a delicate, rapid-fire sound. It was loud enough to pierce a sleeper's consciousness. It was quiet enough to ignore if you hadn't paid your weekly fee. It was a precise, targeted wake-up call. They would wait. They would stand in the freezing rain. They would endure the biting wind. They would watch that window with unyielding patience until a face appeared. They waited for a candle to be struck. They waited for a hand to wave from behind the pane. Only then, when the social contract of the morning was fulfilled, would they move on to the next house. The profession attracted all walks of life. Often, it was the elderly, men and women whose bodies could no longer endure the grueling 16-hour shifts in the mills. It was a way to survive. It was a way to remain useful. Among them, legends were born. Take Mary Smith, a woman from the East End of London who became a local icon. Mary didn't use a pole. She used a pea shooter. She would stand in the center of the street, take a deep breath, and fire dried peas at the windows of her clients with the accuracy of a marksman. It was a brilliant tactical adaptation. It was quieter than a pole. It was faster to deploy. It allowed her to cover more ground in less time. If you close your eyes, you can almost hear the rhythmic patter of those peas against the glass. It was a sound that signaled the start of 1,000 lives every single morning. But as the business grew, a strange, cyclical tension began to emerge in these industrial hubs. It was a paradox that we might call the guardian of time dilemma. If the knocker-upper was the one responsible for waking the entire town, who was responsible for waking the knocker-upper? Think about the sheer, crushing pressure of that role. If you are a knocker-upper and you oversleep, 300 people miss their shift. The factory gates slam shut. The steam engines sit idle. Families go hungry because the breadwinner was locked out for the day. You are the single point of failure for an entire community's economy. Under this pressure, the pace of life began to tighten. The knocker-uppers themselves had to become masters of the short sleep. Many of them became entirely nocturnal, existing in a world of shadows and tea. They were caffeinated by necessity. They were driven by a primal fear of the ticking clock. They often relied on the night watchmen, the men who patrolled the streets to guard against fire and theft, to give them a rough nudge when their shift began at 3 a.m. It was a chain of human reliability. It was a bucket brigade of consciousness. One human soul passing the responsibility of awareness to the next. This was the absolute peak of the era. The pre-dawn streets were alive with a secret language. You had the soft tapping of poles. You had the hushed greetings of people who existed only in the in-between hours. You had a shared experience of the cold and the dark. Waking up was not an act of isolation. It was a moment of human contact. The knocker-upper knew your secrets. They knew who was sick. They knew whose children were crying. They knew who was struggling to get out of bed because of exhaustion or drink or grief. However, as the 20th century turned, the gears of progress began to grind with a new mechanical ferocity. Technology sought to remove the human element from the equation. The mechanical alarm clock, once a luxury for the rich, was now being mass-produced in the very factories that the knocker-uppers had helped staff for generations. By the 1920s and 30s, the alarm was becoming a standard household object. It was cheap. It was efficient. It was heartless. It didn't need a weekly salary. It didn't get the flu. It didn't care if you were mourning or simply exhausted. Slowly, the silhouettes began to vanish from the streets. The long bamboo poles were retired to dusty attics. The pea shooters were put away in velvet-lined drawers. By the time the smoke cleared from the Second World War, the profession was almost entirely extinct. It survived only in small, stubborn pockets of industrial England where the old ways died hard. The last of them, people like Molly Moore, who followed her father into the trade, continued her rounds into the 1970s. But by then they were mere relics. They were curiosities for local newspapers. They were ghosts of a world that had moved on. But here is the twist. This is the part of the story that the history books tend to skip over in favor of progress. When we replaced the knocker-upper with a mechanical clock, we thought we were gaining independence. We thought we were buying freedom. But we lost something far more valuable than a few pence a week. The knocker-upper was more than a clock. They were the original neighborhood watch. Because they were on the streets when everyone else was vulnerable, they were the first to smell smoke from a faulty chimney. They were the first to spot a prowler in an alleyway. They were the first to see a door left ajar by a forgetful child. They were the ones who noticed when an elderly neighbor didn't answer their morning tap, signaling that something was terribly wrong. They were a living layer of social safety. They functioned on a simple, powerful principle: looking out for one another. When we moved that function into a plastic box on our nightstands, we retreated. We moved onto our own private, lonely islands. We traded the human soft touch for a mechanical scream. We traded community vigilance for digital efficiency. We became more on time, certainly. We became more productive, perhaps. But we became significantly more alone in the process. We entered the era of the snooze button. This is a concept that would have been completely alien to a 19th century worker. You couldn't snooze Mary Smith. She wouldn't let you. She didn't just ring and fall silent. She stayed until she saw your face. She stayed because she cared about your survival. She stayed because her livelihood depended on yours. Today we look at our smartphones with a sense of profound dread when the alarm begins its digital dance. We feel a strange, modern exhaustion, a heaviness that never seems to lift no matter how much we sleep. Perhaps that is because we have forgotten a fundamental truth. For thousands of years, waking up was a social act. It was a transition we made together, as a tribe, as a community, as a neighborhood. So, tomorrow morning, when that jarring electronic chirp breaks the silence of your room, take a breath. Don't just hit the screen in a fit of frustration. Don't just roll over and hide. Think about the mist-covered streets of a century ago. Think about the rhythmic tap-tap-tap of a bamboo pole against a high window. Think about the person standing down there in the rain. Think about the stranger who was waiting for a sign of life, holding the responsibility of an entire town in their calloused hands. We think we have conquered time. We believe our gadgets and our perfectly synchronized schedules have made us masters of the universe. But as you lie there in the dark, waiting for the strength to face the world, you might realize the unsettling truth. The machine tells you when to wake up, but it doesn't care if you're ready. It doesn't care if you're okay. It just rings. And in the long silence that follows the beep, the world feels much quieter. It feels much emptier. And perhaps, it feels a little colder than it did when we had someone to knock for us.